What's up? Hey, welcome back. Here we are again, day 5,827,000. It has been quite a long quarantine. What's that? It's only been 3 weeks. There's no way that's possible. I am quite certain it's been 8 years. No, I'm kidding. So, welcome back to the classroom. You're still not here. You're still vacant. I'm here. I'm sitting at a desk now. Isn't this fun? I'm going to use Zoom to do this, so that way I can, you can see the PowerPoint closer, and it's not quite as far away. We're going to talk more about the Civil War. Welcome back. And one thing I do want to address real quick is some little housekeeping things. So if you're listening, pay attention, please. Using the same, look, some of you think you're sly, and you are all sharing with each other, your answers, for assignments, quizzes, tests. Now I want to remind you one thing specifically: that can be cheating. All right. I'm not necessarily saying you all are doing it, but I know some of you are doing it, and I really don't want to get into all of that. That is, that gets into our Gatewood code of conduct type stuff. This is the important thing, because I don't even really feel like you guys notice that you're not being really smart about how you're going about doing this. Many of you are getting the right answers, and the reason why I'm not getting on you harder, like I'm not directly calling this out, and I want to make sure that you understand that the issue is this. The issue is not necessarily cheating outright, like you're used to. When we talk about cheating, you tend to think like, oh, I'm looking at somebody else's stuff, or I'm doing something that isn't mine. If I give you guys a selection of readings, or if I give you a selection of questions and all that, and you just go in and you type in that question to Google, or you just type in that name of somebody into Wikipedia, and you get like a sentence out of Wikipedia, and you just copy and paste that, that's not really the issue here. The issue is that you guys are doing that, but you're getting the wrong piece of information off of the wrong site and turning that in as your answer, which in and of itself would not be a problem, but then you're sharing it to everybody else. So everybody's giving me the same wrong answers that sometimes don't even make sense. Sometimes you're just going in, and whoever's doing it is just saying like, oh, I'm just going to type in Paul Cuff in Wikipedia, and then the first words that come up, I'm just going to copy the first 4 words, not even the first full sentence, just the first like 5 words. I'm going to copy that and paste it, and it doesn't even make sense, guys. It's not answering the question. It's ultimately, this is the problem with it. It's not helping you. In order to understand this stuff, I need you guys to come along with me, and actually, you've got to commit to doing this as well. I'm not going to be able to be, with you. I'm not going to be able to, kind of ensure that you're getting this stuff. So you're going to have to kind of keep yourself accountable. And, like sharing work, like doing that kind of stuff, it ultimately is not going to help you. And second of all, like, you're not really even getting it right. Like, you guys are getting answers. You're sharing answers that aren't even correct and don't even make sense if you just read them. Like, if you just read them, you would notice that sentence doesn't even make sense. So make sure you're not doing that. Like, I'm not an idiot. I see what you're doing. I don't want y'all to do that. And ultimately, it's not benefiting you in the long run if you're doing that. Like, this is about you. Like, this isn't about me. This isn't about, your parents. This isn't about, like the administrator, like Mr. Decker. This is about you. Like, this is to benefit you. So make sure that, in your education, you are actually committing to you learning, because at the end of the day, like, if you want to cheat through things, if you want to just not learn things, if you just, are content with that, like, and you're going to go to all these different lengths to do that, like, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of your time. So, like, and it's a waste of my time. So, like, commit to doing this. Commit to actually, finding the right answers, learning the right answers, reading the material, and then again, there's not some magic formula. I'm not asking you to, like do math, we're talking about really big, broad topics. So, a lot of this stuff just, if I'm talking about slavery, if I'm talking about some guy, like find me information on that. Tell me in your words, not just move information from point A to point B, find out who he is and then say, oh, this is who he is. If I said, who's Miss Moss, you would say, oh, well, Miss Moss is, and you would tell me about her based off what you know, right? You would not just go into the phone book and copy down her phone number and say, this is who she is. Like, that doesn't tell me. So just keep that in mind. All right, anyways, off my soapbox. Doesn't change how I feel about you. Still love you, but hey, get it together because you're starting to look like a bunch of foolish vagabonds. It's a big word. Besides all that, hey, let's get back to old Doughface here. Where we last left off, we were talking about the presidents and the different leaders leading up to the Civil War. And man, are there some great ones. You got old Jimmy Buchanan, you got Handsome Frank, old Millard Fillmore. Who doesn't remember Millard Fillmore, am I right? Zachary Taylor, James Knox Polk, John Tyler, these guys, I mean, all of them. So, those guys, and look, I'm joking, but the problem is many of these guys are largely forgotten because the country was in such a state of constant quarrel with one another that no executive, no president could actually get anything done. And many of them were constantly keeping the country from pulling itself apart or fighting with each other. They're putting out fires. They're putting together compromises. And there's no real big, long-lasting, achievements of a lot of these guys. Because during their presidencies, they were mostly just trying to keep everything together. Now, in the case of this guy, James Buchanan, possibly the worst president of all time, he basically didn't even do that. Under his presidency, the country tears itself apart. He is the last president before the Civil War, and at the end of his presidency, I think 7 states had seceded, including Georgia. So yeah, way to go, James. So we were kind of talking about compromises. We were talking about the different compromises that had been going on, and Congress passes a set of laws called the Kansas and Nebraska Territories, which it was Kansas and Nebraska Act, which allowed in 1854 Kansas and Nebraska to come in as these territories that could vote on whether or not slavery would be permitted inside of them. So they said basically, if you want slaves, you can vote on there to be slaves. If you want there not to be slaves, then you can vote on that. The people decide in each state was the idea here. So many abolitionists were really upset about this. Many slave supporters are rushing in to try and make sure that these states come in as slave states. They move into these territories. People from the North who are abolitionists move in to try and prevent them from making this a slave state. There are people who live on the border in like Missouri, and they go into Kansas to try and intimidate people and burn stuff and kill people and make a big mess to intimidate people to not vote for abolition, to vote for slavery. They're called the Border Ruffians. And then there's a group of people in Kansas who move to Kansas and become anti-slavery. And those people are actually called Jayhawks. And then the Jayhawks, which is actually the mascot of the University of Kansas, if you're into college basketball or college football or anything, the Kansas Jayhawks, they get their name because people who were pro-freedom, anti-slavery people were called Jayhawks. And they fought. And this fight between the Border Ruffians, the pro-slavery people, the anti-slavery people, becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And this takes place under the presidency of Franklin Pierce. And it is basically a miniature Civil War that takes place before the Civil War. It's kind of like the prequel to the Civil War, but in a much smaller scale, just fought in the state of Kansas over the issue of slavery, whether or not Kansas would be a slave state or a free state. And we call this Bleeding Kansas. It was kind of like a national crisis. And of course, Franklin Pierce basically does nothing, which is why you're not a big fan of old Handsome Frank here, which I have on my wall there. kind of ironically. But there were separate governments that were set up in Kansas at the time. Guys like John Brown, who was a famous guy you probably need to know about. He led these attacks. John Brown believed that he was this prophetic figure of God, that God had sent him, and he kind of related himself to Moses. I think he might have even thought he was some type of manifestation of like a Moses for that time period. He grew his beard out really long to look like one of those old prophets from the Old Testament, and looked like Moses. And he believed that a race war was coming, and that his job was to inspire Black people to rise up from their slave masters and to start a rebellion, start a revolution, and kill all the slave masters. So yeah, he was pretty hated in the South, John Brown. He was despised by Southerners. He was like the worst person in the world. But further dooming the compromise of 1850 was that the North did not return the runaways like they had promised. Remember, in the compromise of 1850, they said that the North would have to agree to the fugitive slave law, meaning that if slaves were caught in the North, they had to be returned to the South. Any runaways on the Underground Railroad must be returned. And of course, that was still not happening. And this really upsets the South. Now, what was the Georgia platform that they came up with? They said, as long as the North goes along with the compromise, we will stay in the Union. But if they do not, we're going to leave, right? So the relationship between North and South, the relationship between slave states and free states is falling apart in the 1850s. It is rapidly deteriorating. And many abolitionists became more outspoken. The abolitionist movement grows and grows and grows. It's mostly due to things like there's a newspaper called The Liberator, which you guys had to write on, by William Lloyd Garrison. There's a book that comes out, which we'll talk about in a second, called Uncle Tom's Cabin. There are reports, guys like Frederick Douglass and people like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman that are working to promote freedom for slaves, and many people are joining this cause. It's a growing cause in the North. And actually, a political party is founded, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, but there's a political party founded in the North where many of the people in that party were abolitionists, and that party is called the Republican Party. So here is an image of these border ruffians, these people all making their way to Kansas to fight in bleeding Kansas. This is something that happens in just to show you how divided and how crazy things were at the time. There is a Southern senator that beats another Northern senator almost to death. Charles Sumner is beat almost to death with a cane in the Capitol, in the national Capitol, on Capitol Hill. This guy Charles Sumner is making a speech against the evils of slavery, and this other guy from South Carolina comes up with his cane and beats this guy almost to death for talking about slavery. Southerners at this time were very defensive of slavery, very opposed to the idea of abolition. And this really does a lot to, this is a political cartoon, Southern chivalry, argument versus clubs. Look at these monsters that these Southerners are. These Southerners are willing to beat people to death during political discourse. They won't let them talk. They're willing to fight over this issue. And this is really bad PR. This is bad public relations for the South. And many Northerners are really, they don't take this very good. This only strengthens a lot of Southerners. Many of the Southerners see this as like, yeah, take that. That's how we're going to be. They take pride in that. And again, this is just furthering the divide between North and the South. When people say things like, the country has never been as divided as it is now. I'm like, really? Because look at this. So the anti-slavery movement, though, let's talk about that abolition movement. So as the demand of slavery rose in the South, the more slaves we need, the price also rises. The idea here being more money, you get more land, you get more cotton, you can buy more slaves, and you can get more money. And then the process just keeps going and going and going. More and more money in it means more and more land and slaves, and you can grow more, you make more. So this also there's a finite amount of slaves though. Remember, they ended the African slave trade, meaning that like they weren't bringing in slaves still from Africa. So the slaves in America were all the slaves. Like there weren't more slaves outside of slaves, just having kids. But they weren't bringing in boatloads still. So there was the price of slaves was going up because the demand was going up. Supply and demand. Right? Anti-slavery attitudes existed in Georgia throughout its history, but in antebellum times, it was not tolerated. So if you were anti-slavery in Georgia, you better keep your mouth shut because they were willing to, you would be social, you were an outcast. Like if you were willing to go against the way that it was and the way that the system was, you probably were going to not only lose friends, lose positions, lose your power, lose your say, but you might also be thrown in jail legitimately. Like in the antebellum South, anti-slavery attitudes were really not tolerated. Even when the Georgia Journal newspaper printed a piece suggesting the gradual reduction of slavery, meaning like they suggested in a newspaper, they suggested that a way that we could gradually reduce slavery over time, the backlash was terrible. Officials of the newspaper observed that no newspaper would ever dare oppose slavery, and they actually issued an official apology for issuing this idea that maybe you would reduce the need of slaves. Like, how dare you even suggest that slavery could. So even the idea that you were saying like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this so much, was enough for people to, demand you give an apology. So really, really wasn't tolerated. But talking about, this was something in your readings, some slaves were freed. When slave owners would die, occasionally they would leave in their wills that the slaves were to be freed. Probably the most famous people of these, not in Georgia, but one of the most famous people of these was George Washington. When George Washington died, he made a provision that all of his slaves be freed. Technically, it's for when his wife died, but regardless. Another one of these was a guy named Richard Tubman. He paid for all of his slaves to be freed and have a paid way to go back to Africa, and we'll talk about that. But the Georgia state government didn't like this. They didn't like these laws. I mean, they didn't like this idea that people were freeing their slaves, because then they would have to deal with, well, what do we do with all these freed blacks? Like, what do we do with them? Because, again, the idea of freed slaves being successful was threatening to the society. The idea that a freed slave could go out and be more successful than a poor white person really broke down the whole idea of slavery in a lot of ways, right? Because their whole idea was based around this notion that slaves are inferior, black people are inferior, is what they said, right? And therefore that if they could be better at something, then that breaks down the whole idea that white people are just infinitely superior just because they are. So they tried to create laws to stop masters from freeing their slaves. They didn't want freed slaves. They didn't want to have to deal with them. But there were always ways around this. Like some masters just allowed their slaves to live as freedmen and live on the property, or like technically they'd still be listed as a slave, but they basically were just like, you can just be free, like whatever. Some took their slaves to freed states and just released them, like just said, all right, you're free to go. And they took them up to a state where there was no slavery, and they just say go. Now, here's one of the things people don't realize, though. A lot of times when people talk about free states and slave states, we tend to think that free states were all pro-equality or pro-abolition, and the idea that like they wanted the black people to be equal and they wanted them to come live with them, and there would be this nice, like everyone, oh, we're just, we believe in civil rights and we believe that everyone's equal and we don't believe in white supremacy. That's not actually the case. Many of these states in the North that were free states did not want these freed blacks to be moving into their states. Remember, people in the North were every bit as white supremacist or racist or whatever you want to call it, prejudiced as people in the South were. They just did not believe in slavery. That doesn't necessarily mean that they had, modern ideas about how race works. Many of them still had this idea of white supremacy. And many of these northern states did not want freed blacks to come live amongst them, again, because of their own, their own ideas and their own prejudices. Actually, I think Indiana in the antebellum South actually made it illegal to be black. Black people couldn't live in Indiana during the mid 1800s. So, states did that. It's the idea that all the northern states were just, bastions of freedom, and equality is really not true. They were many people were pro or anti-slavery, and many people were abolitionists, but the idea of abolitionists isn't necessarily the same thing we think of today as being racial equality. They didn't necessarily believe in that. So Liberia, though, so Paul Cuff, this guy that a lot of you couldn't really figure out who he was. Paul Cuff was a free black person who lived in the North. He actually was very successful. He was a shipping merchant, and he thought that black people would never really be able to be Corona, never really be able to be totally free in the United States. And he thought that the best way, the only real way for them to really be successful and to have true equality was to move back to Africa, or to move to Africa. I say back because historically they were from Africa, but they were not from Africa in that they had ever been there. Like most of the people in the 1800s in America who were black had never been. They were third generation slaves. Yeah, he wanted to start up a colony in Africa for slaves. So in 1816, the American Colonization Society was formed, and many members were from the North and the South. The purpose was to raise money for supplies to return free blacks to Africa. And I put that in quotations because, again, you say return, but they weren't actually from there. Their ancestors were from there. So this society had many people from the South, though, and you might be saying, like, wait, why would there be Southerners who want there to be a part of this? Like, why would they? Well, it's actually pretty obvious. Southerners definitely wanted free blacks to be gone, right? We've already said that many of them saw this as a problem. So the idea that you would take all those free blacks that had been removed from slavery and you take them, put them on a boat, and take them away, many Southerners were absolutely totally on board with this. And actually, one of the leaders was from Georgia. His name was William H. Crawford, and he was the Secretary of the Treasury. And he was a pretty influential and important guy back in the mid-1800s, early 1800s. So about 12,000 ex-slaves were sent to colonize West Africa, and the country of Liberia became independent in 1847. It was a U.S. colony, and it was given its independence in 1847. One of the first truly free republics in Africa post-African colonialism. It was established right next to Sierra Leone, which is still a country today, which was very similar. It was a colony set up by the British for the same purpose, for freed slaves from the Americas. Liberia is still a country to this day, and it's the only national capital. It has the only national capital outside of the United States that has a city named after a U.S. president. Their capital is Monrovia. And it's named after James Monroe, who was the president of the United States at the time. So at least 18 Georgia masters paid for their slaves to journey to Liberia. So at least 18 Georgians had their slaves go when they were freed to Liberia. Richard Tubman left his 42 slaves with $10,000, which was a ton of money at that time, in his will, to return to Africa. And later, one of his descendants became the president of Liberia. So interesting. The Tubman name, slaves a lot of times took the last name of their master. And the Tubman name has been big in politics in Liberia for some time. And that they're descendants of slaves that came from the Tubman plantation of Georgia in the early 1800s. Here's Paul Cuff. He was of Native American and African slave roots, and he was a successful black person who lived in the North. He was a shipping merchant. So he's right there as Southerners wouldn't have liked him because he broke the rule that they kind of set in their minds that black people just couldn't be successful. Well, he was very successful. Here's a map of Liberia, and you might notice that their flag looks suspiciously like another flag you might know, right? I wonder what they based their flag on. It's because they were a U.S. colony. They were started by us. Liberia comes from liber, which is where we get the word liberty, right? The root being liberty, freedom, and Monrovia after James Monroe. And then free blacks in Georgia, remember, free blacks in Georgia had virtually no rights. We've talked about this before. They had to maintain some form of job, or they could be re-enslaved by the government and sold to a new master. So one of the punishments for slaves, if they could not prove they had a job, or if they were unemployed at the time, was that they could be re-enslaved. Also, if they had broke any law, really, they could usually be re-enslaved. It was difficult for them to hold jobs because many people didn't want to employ them. So again, a lot of people didn't give them jobs because they thought they were lazy, and a lot of times people thought they were lazy because they didn't have jobs. So it was kind of like a circle. And then, of course, they could be re-enslaved. They also had to have a legal white guardian, which we've talked about before, somebody who reported the government of their affairs. So basically kept tabs on them, kept an idea of what they were doing, checked in on them. Now, this person could exploit them, for example, because they were the ones who were supposed to be giving a report. And if they gave a bad report, it could reflect badly on you. So you wanted to keep them happy. A lot of times those people required you to have some type of, do something for them, basically. Many times this was their former master's family. So if someone said, you better do this for me, or I'm going to tell them you're not doing what you're supposed to. It kind of held them at ransom, free blacks. They had very little legal rights, though, but they could own property. That's one of the things that they could do. They could own property. But some helped on the Underground Railroad. This is something that you were supposed to know a good bit about. The Underground Railroad is the thing that everybody, likes to talk about. It's very famous. It took slaves from plantations in the South, and it was a network of safe houses, safe places to hide them on their trip, either to the North, to Canada, and maybe people don't talk about it actually, but a lot went to Mexico, went to Florida to live with Indians, like the Seminole. Many of them went to Oklahoma. Many of them went to the Bahamas. So it depended on kind of where you were. If you lived in South Georgia, Canada wasn't really a very smart, because it's not nearly as close as somewhere like the Bahamas, or if you live in Texas, going to the North, why would you go there instead of going to Mexico? So, because, it was freedom in Mexico, slavery was outlawed. So the abolition movement, though, is going to grow. Abolition movement grew strong in the 1800s in the North. Many ex-slaves became prominent figures in anti-slavery. People like Harriet Tubman. She was a conductor or a leader on the Underground Railroad. They led men and women on a system of trails to freedom. Frederick Douglass was another one. He himself was a runaway slave. He was an outspoken abolitionist, and he worked on newspapers. He was a speech giver, a speaker. He spoke against the evils of slavery. He was very influential. He actually became the Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant's, he became his ambassador to Haiti. Another famous abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison, who you had to write about. He wrote a newspaper called The Liberator. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this famous novel. It's like one of the greatest, it's one of the best-selling novels in American history. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's so popular that it's actually the first American novel to receive fame overseas. Like Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom read it. It was this huge thing, and it really brought a lot of people's ideas about slavery. It changed their ideas. So a lot of people, maybe they didn't have an opinion about slavery, maybe thought it wasn't that bad, and they read the book and they're like, oh my God, it's terrible. Now, the thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin is it did a great job telling people about the evils of slavery. But the problem with it is that the person who wrote it was writing from her own perceptions of it. So she actually did not know as a fact about this stuff. She was writing, demonizing it, which it should be demonized. I don't have a problem with that. But she wrote actually from a position that she had not had any experience in. So many of the things that she wrote was, obviously it was a novel. So a lot of it was made up. A lot of it was dramatized. But it really upset a lot of people in the South at the time because they felt like this was, venom being spewed against them. Like they're all these horrible people, which they were doing something horrible. I'm not defending them, but to give you an idea, they all saw this as the worst. Owning copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin, owning copies of the Liberator newspaper could get you in jail in Georgia. That's how much people hated this, how much people saw this as, propaganda against them. And Southerners really see this. I mean, they feel like everybody's ganging up on them. They feel like everybody's out to get them. They feel like there's enemies everywhere, that the North has turned their back on them, that there's no unity. So Southerners, when they do secede, you got to remember, in their eyes, they see that the nation has turned against them. It's like this own self, paranoia, this own self, this idea that, everybody's out to get them, and that everybody's coming to get them, and everyone's persecuting them, and they're the victims somehow in all of this. So you got to keep that in mind. Southerners were outraged by Northern abolitionists and their attacks on white Southern society. The Georgia General Assembly passed a $5,000 reward for anyone caught selling or distributing the Liberator. If you got caught with the Liberator newspaper, a copy of the Liberator, you could be thrown in jail. You could be punished by death. Like, they could kill you because they passed a $5,000. So if I caught you with one, I could turn you in and I could get $5,000 and you could get the death sentence. That's how much, I want you to understand, that's the lengths, that's the depths that people felt about, all of this that was going on. People were that upset about it. Again, the country has never been more divided than it is now. Again, that's not true. Read this stuff. Look at the Civil War. Look at the time before the Civil War. Here's Harriet Tubman, obviously when she was a little bit older. This is what the $20 bill is going to look like within the next 10 years. They're going to phase out Andrew Jackson off the 20, and they're going to add her. Now, I don't know that this is actually what it's going to look like. This is some artist rendering of probably what it may look like. I don't know. They might have a different picture of her, or maybe a more flattering picture of her. But yeah, she's going to be on the 20, which is fine. They changed money a lot. A lot of people got really upset about this. Like, how dare they? But, based on what you guys maybe have read so far and learned so far about Andrew Jackson, I don't know it's necessarily a bad thing to get him off. He hated paper money. It's kind of ironic that he's on paper money. In his presidency, he went after the United States Bank and tried to get rid of the idea of paper money, banknotes. And Harriet Tubman fought to free people from slavery. So, I mean, which one do you really want to be, the guy against Harriet Tubman and for Andrew Jackson, the guy who did the Trail of Tears? Whatever. Here's Frederick Douglass. Good looking guy when he's young. And then he looks like, when he's older, he looks like Doc Brown from Back to the Future. But yeah, he was actually from a plantation in, I believe, in Virginia, or maybe in Maryland, Delaware, one of those places. And he escaped slavery and went to the North and went to Europe and was educated, learned how to read, learned how to write, and all that kind of stuff. And he came back, and he was a very, very famous orator, speaker, writer, newspaper publisher, and all that kind of stuff. So one of the most famous guys for the abolition movement. Here's a copy of the Liberator that you could get $5,000 fine for, or a $5,000 reward, I guess, for turning in. And it was, again, William Lloyd Garrison. It was a newspaper produced to try and convince people to become abolitionists. Here is an image from Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is, a book that was written to try and convince people, again, to turn against slavery by telling how horrible it is and how gruesome and terrible and sad it is. And it is definitely all of those things. There you go. Uncle Tom getting whipped. So we're going to talk real quick. Last thing, resistance. How did they resist? So blacks were extremely limited in their daily life on how they could resist. Obviously, just picking up arms and just fighting wasn't necessarily an option. If they did that, they would almost certainly die. Even if they killed their master, slave revolts did happen. They had happened before, but they always were put down, and slaves were all killed. You have to also remember, slaves were uneducated. That doesn't mean they're stupid. They just didn't know much about the outside world. Many of them had been born on a plantation, and many of them lived on that plantation or another plantation their entire lives. They had never been off those plantations hardly. And they also lived in constant state of fear. So many of them did not want to jeopardize what they had and what was going on. And they didn't really see a way out, but they could resist in other ways. So they could not read or write or assemble, in fear that there would be a revolt. And actually, believe it or not, they were not even allowed to have drums, because slave masters tended to think that if they had drums, they could signal and communicate with other plantations, and they could use drum beats to signal a revolt. Yes, as ridiculous as that sounds, that's how paranoid these slave masters were. Slaves resisted in many other ways, though, besides just outright killing their masters. Obviously, that's the most obvious one. Like, why didn't they just kill them? Well, that's not always the immediate reaction. That's not always necessarily something that's going to solve your problems. Actually, that usually creates more problems for you, killing someone. So sometimes work slowdowns, intentional work slowdowns, setting fires, acting dumb to instructions, acting like you don't understand instructions. You telling me that I'm just a dumb slave and I just don't get anything. Well, I'm going to act like a dumb slave that just doesn't get anything, right? Breaking equipment intentionally, stealing. Many times they had to steal, though, just to eat. Many times they had to steal just to get by. People say that if slaves weren't stealing, they were starving to death. So many slaves had to resort to stealing regardless. Many slaves simply feared the unknown and feared punishment for running away. We've talked about before, if you did run away, the punishments were usually pretty severe. You were branded as a runaway, so that way, if you were ever sold again, you would be sold for cheaper than you normally would be, and you did not want to be sold cheap because you were worked harder and you were treated more poorly if you were sold cheap. Just think about the idea: if you pay more for something, you're gonna take more care of it than if you pay cheap for something, right? If you got a shirt at the dollar store, you don't care about it. I mean, if you get it at Goodwill, you don't care about it as much as if you get it at, Supreme or something. You didn't think I knew about Supreme, did you? Slavery was simply all that most of them had ever known. But this idea, this desire to be free is human nature. It's a human instinct. Everyone wants to be free. So we can't just say like, oh, well, it's all they knew, so they're just happy with it. No, I mean, they might have, there's some slaves might have been content in their suffering. Like they might have been like, okay, well, this is the best I've got. But that doesn't mean that they did not want to be free. Like slaves, it is inherent in human beings to want to be free, to not want to be part of a society that deprives you of your natural rights and of your freedoms and your ambitions. As the 1860s approached, though, tensions continued to rise, and the fate of slavery, the nation, would eventually be decided on a long and costly war. So all of those things are things that are very, very important, that led up to some of the fundamental causes. And next video, we're going to talk about fundamental causes versus immediate causes of the Civil War. Everybody wants to talk about the reasons or the causes of the Civil War. It's like one of the things that everybody always wants to talk about. What's the cause of the Civil War? What was the cause? Like this big fight that everyone wants to have. And it almost feels like that people want to somehow place blame or move blame or kind of redefine what we think the Civil War was. And the reality is it is complex. It's very complex, but it definitely revolves around the economics of slavery. 100%, you can't get away from the fact that slavery is the largest factor in the Civil War. And there's a lot of things that play into that as well. There's a lot of things that come off of that, and there's a lot of things that are caused by that. So we're going to talk about in the next video, the next thing, immediate causes and fundamental causes. So look forward to that. Miss you guys. Have a great rest of your day, and have a great, I guess, rest of this school year without me. Oh, sad. But the show must go on. Well, see ya.